So, welcome to Conscious Mumbai. I'm really happy to have you on the panel discussion for Conscious Mumbai. So, I have to ask you a few questions since you have been working in Mumbai and a lot of international projects also. You have been working a lot in urban design, for various cities from Mumbai. What is or how would you define urban intimate scapes?
Thank you, Prachi, for inviting me. I'm going to try and answer to the best of my ability what your questions are. Um, if I understand it correct, the intimate scapes, you're probably referring to some small spaces that sort of interstitial spaces, but um, you're also implying a smaller scale, more intimate scale.
Right.
And you're not speaking about huge um, urban plazas and spaces like Central Park, like what we have in New York City, but the kind of leftover found spaces that exist between buildings and in the smaller streets, becoming little larger squares and plazas. So that's my understanding. But on the other hand, from a sort of experiential point of view, the small gets defined in different ways. So if I can sort of refer you back to an amazing writer called Kevin Lynch, and he talked about image of the city, where he describes the sort of a relationship with the city is defined by the manner in which we interact with the city, and not so much by the kind of scales that either overwhelm us or underwhelm us. And that sort of gets tied back into our own perception of the city that we live in, and a relationship with it in terms of memories, in terms of history of the place, along with the history of your own association with it. So the scale becomes a lot more intimate in terms of psychological, or what I define as what I define as psychogeography of the place, which is very different than the sort of physical geography of the place.
Correct.
So that changes your associations fairly quickly. So even in a very large space, from that point of view, you could feel very intimate. Because of your association with a particular spot, particular corner. So, for example, every time when I go to Central Park, there are few spaces that I'm totally by myself. And I have a sort of very fond memory of it because sometimes I go bird watching in some certain places. Other times I go riding my bicycle. And sometimes I just sort of jog around the big lake. And then all of them, I actually carry a memory of that in my mind. So though Central Park is very big, very large, my association with these particular instances and experiences of the space itself make me relate to that space at a very, very intimate scale. And that has nothing to do with the big concert that takes place in Great Lawn, where you have practically 50,000 people gathering. So, and then the other part of this sort of intimate scape is that what Yannis Plasma describes, in his book called Eyes of the Skin, is again, it sort of goes back into not merely an experience that you derive from a place, but an event that might have happened in that place. And you remember the space by the event more than by the place itself. So, for example, when I visit Bombay sometimes, and when I used to visit more often when we had that office totally functional, and if I happen to be around when there's a festival going on, and I see, I might be pronouncing it wrong, but the Krishna birth festival where they actually make a human pyramid.
Janmashtami, it's called,
Right, but there's a time when they make the human pyramid.
Yes.
And certain intersections of the city, when I'm sort of driving through in a car, and I see this whole human pyramid being sort of constructed while I'm driving by. What remains in my memory is not the street, not just, I don't even know the name of the place, but the whole picture vividly stays in my mind.
Right.
So what I'm talking about is that it's an event space.
Right. This is
It's
also
it's a,
theory. There's also theory which you are correctly speaking. In environmental psychology, this is also called as the place attachment theory. So this is precisely what reflects, like, which remains with us always.
it does.
Yeah. Yeah. Correct.
No, I remember there was a place in city of Ahmedabad, and I remember when I was much younger, and I used to go and visit my granny and whatnot. And there was a place called Liberty Corner right next to SET School of Architecture.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist there. And even when I used to visit, there was actually no place. In fact, it wasn't even a corner.
Oh.
But it was called Liberty Corner because there used to be a tea stall by the name Liberty Corner.
Okay. Right. Right.
And it was right in the middle of the block. It wasn't even at the corner. The stall disappeared long time ago. But at that point in time, I'm talking about early 90s, I would think. And at that point in time, a lot of people knew that place as Liberty Corner. So one time when I was there, I said, "Where is this Liberty Corner? Can you show us? You're in it."
Okay.
So I said, "But it doesn't look like a corner." He said, "No, there used to be a place called Liberty Corner." Similarly, and you remember the office where you worked on near
Absolutely.
Bandra Station.
Absolutely.
Very often when I would tell people where the office is, and I'll give them all the landmarks,
Yeah.
and when they come, they say, "Oh, you should have just told me. It's right near Copper Chimney."
Exactly.
And I said, "Copper Chimney? There is no such thing as Copper Chimney." No, there used to be a restaurant across
Yeah,
the
that's what I
street.
was saying. There was a restaurant right in front of our office.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I never knew. I mean, I obviously didn't know because I was an outsider. I still am an outsider.
Yeah.
But I had the privilege of being an outsider and insider both.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I share the sort of cultural ties
Exactly.
and blood ties to the place. But it was amazing because they remembered the place by the name of a restaurant that wasn't even there.
Right. I
So,
remember the times, when we used to explain the people that, the third building from the lake, and they used to call it Talav, if you remember, Bandra Talav, it was called. And I remember because we used to give directions probably to, because we used to order food. So we used to tell them, third building from the Talav is where you have to come. So they had to literally landmarks, Kevin Lynch, what you're talking about. So PWC, you remember the building right across the street, PWC? Yeah. So we used to exactly talk about the thing which you are right now speaking, memories associated to places. So even now, now that I'm in Bombay and I have been moving around, it is so fascinating to go around our office area. I tell my folks that this is the place where I used to work. And in fact, one day, I think 2 years back, I literally climbed up Gopal Mansion and I went across the entire building just because I wanted to. And to my fascination, it was sort of same. I still saw that ODP uncle, he was there down. So, it's just very fascinating to know that how we associate ourselves with memories. Place attachment theory is what I totally believe in. Yes.
right, but then it goes a little bit beyond. You have individual memory,
Yeah.
and that's one thing, but you also have collective memories.
Correct.
So, for example, when I was a kid and I would come to Bombay, I used to, one of my uncles lived in a place called Grant Road. And I do remember that it had a very different scale and it looked like a village. It felt like a village. And after years, when I started doing some work in India, and that was around 2011, 2012, when we took on a couple of projects. And when I would come, one time I said, "Let me just go there and see what it's like." Believe it or not, it still feels like a little village. It's a place called Nana Chowk.
Okay.
Which is where later on I gathered that Gandhi's little what do you call it? There's a building, there's a space where he lived for a little while, and it's some kind of an institute right now. It's near Nana Chowk, and it's called Nana Chowk. Chowk means a little sort of opening in the middle of thickly woven fabric of the city, and then you have the opera house further down. So there are landmarks and there are spaces between that actually acquire significance because of a landmark very often.
Right.
And the interstitial spaces are very important because in urban design, I mean, I'm an architect, urban design, and a product designer.
Yeah.
So I wear different hats at different times. So from little paperclip to stationery to large buildings, and like what we're working in South Korea right now, in Seoul, which is a very large 160-acre site, which we are designing. So these are the sort of multiple scales that we sort of think about. But it's always the increment that makes the city. It's always the grain that you have to look at. You talk about fabric, you can't talk about fabric without understanding what makes that fabric come about.
True.
So it is these interstitial spaces that you really, as urban designers, you're always looking at the room outside, not room inside.
Right.
So the street is the room outside. The buildings are what architects deal with. So we design the room outside, not room inside.
Yes. And a city like Mumbai, where it's difficult to delineate where your private space ends and where the public space starts. Why the spaces are being getting into each other.
It sort of goes back to it's a cultural phenomenon. And the presentation that I was talking to you about does deal with that a little bit. The distinction between community and property is very different in parts of India. It's changing now because people are getting a little more westernized, and they're kind of very clear set of boundaries that people like to draw, and then now you have the sort of watchmen and guards that you can't go beyond a certain point. But when all of those things didn't exist, the community and property were sort of overlapping with each other. So there were gray zones much more. It wasn't black and white.
True.
So the relationship between outside and inside was very different. So if you walk around cities like Bombay and even Ahmedabad, for example, very often you see these very tiny interwoven streets, the network of streets, and sometimes you'll see a building, the ground floor is emptied out, and then so that you can connect two streets, and the house is actually above the street.
Yeah.
And it becomes a kind of a gateway. And you'll see that, in many other cities in Rajasthan, it's very common that you have a kind of Havelis after Havelis after Havelis.
Yeah.
And then when you come to a dead end and you think it is a dead end, when you look to the left and you find a gate, and the building is actually lying above. It is actually still there. So, and then people make room for each other because, jokingly, as to say, the cows have to go through. You have to make sure that they find a way out.
Yes, yes.
So, no, I think it depends on that. It depends. Also, the sort of whole structure of the city goes back to the structure of the family.
Correct.
So you start with the Haveli, your house. A family grows and it becomes a little vada. And it becomes a kind of little neighborhood. Right. So it's the same family that multiplies and it becomes a cluster. And then the clusters, different family clusters coming together form a village.
Right.
And different villages, like in Bombay. Bombay is 26 villages. People seem to forget that. Yeah. Bombay is, in my opinion, Bombay is an outgrown village. Yes. And it feels that way even today. Right. Because it's interlinked villages, at least 26, probably more. Right. I might be totally wrong about it. And that's the beauty of it. That's the finer grain. And that makes the task much harder for urban design folks to come in and say, okay, we're going to clean this up. We're going to sanitize this place. We're going to clear large chunks of land, and we're going to build these tall buildings or whatever have you. Right. And that's how you murder a city. That's how you butcher a city.
That is what I was going to come to. Very interestingly, I've said that, it goes back to the structure of family. And now if you've seen the progression, the real estate has taken over the city like anything. So the entire real estate has gone for loss. If we see that, if I can ask you that, how would you define development? What does a city dweller feel? What is the first thing that comes into the head of a city dweller when he talks about development?
There are different ways in which you look at it. Like I described to you, a family grows
Yeah.
and needs more room. There's a house, which is a single story house. They need more room, they build on top, or they acquire the lot next door. This is how the sort of cities, and I mean, that's how the nuclear families begin to occupy more space and multiply and spread out, forming clusters. That was a very sort of natural, organic way of growth, so to speak, very organic.
Right.
And it was with the help of a multiplication of the aggregate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you're talking about speculation driving development,
Mm-hmm.
that changes the whole scenario. So somebody finds out that such and such location is now pretty hot because Bollywood actors live around there, for example, Bandra West.
Yeah.
And there's this little town, little village which used to be occupied by the sort of Christians who lived there before, the Portuguese village or Shirley village or whatever you have.
Yeah.
So you find these old buildings, and they are in bad shape. They need to be redeveloped. So in the name of redevelopment, they increase speculation.
Yeah.
So they create a kind of hype. But before they create the hype, they basically acquire all those properties at much lower rate. And then propose something that they might not even own the property, but they can propose ideas, they throw out images to create a sense of speculation. The speculation drives the market. The speculation drives the property prices up.
Right.
Speculation presents an image of the city that might be very alien, but is very seductive.
Right.
It can kind of tickle the imagination to make you think that you actually are not in Bombay anymore. You're in this amazingly beautiful Shangri-La.
Yeah.
Or a place that sort of, that existed only in your imagination. Now you're going to make it a reality.
Correct.
And that sort of drives. So depending on who approaches what, the development gets defined.
And also, we have been blindly copying the West.
Which is another phenomenon. But there's also the sort of, you have planning regulations and rules in place. And the political will also drives speculations in many different ways. So if you want to sort of, let's say you are, I don't know what the equivalent of assembly person is from Thane, but if you want to drive speculation up in Thane because you're going to, get X number of votes, then you tend to push your own agenda.
Yeah.
And change the laws or ban the laws to create speculation, increase the FSI. We call it FAR here, but increase the FSI so the speculation goes up. Yeah. Or this is out. These properties are on the outskirts of the city. You can acquire them. They're agricultural land. You can acquire them only for farmhouses.
Yeah.
So you acquire it for farmhouses. Then they change the law and they say these will be now certified as non-agricultural land.
Yeah.
So the farmhouses will allow you to do only one little farmhouse in 0.12 or 0.5 FSI. Suddenly you got a 5 FSI. So you bought something for X amount. Now you can build 5 times more and you can charge 50 times more.
Right.
So this is how you said. So everyone, if there are too many stakeholders. So every stakeholder, starting with the consumer. Consumer is actually the last guy. He's the one exploited. He's the one who actually pays for it. But from city government, planning departments and regulation and administrative zones that are created, they also instigate change in terms of pushing speculation up. So I'm not quite sure how to respond to your question. Development is good, but who's driving that development? If it is sort of a grassroots development, and the community comes together, forms cooperatives.
Okay, so that brings me to an interesting thing. Just out of curiosity, I want to know, so do we still have a humanitarian approach or not? Or have we just lost it somewhere? We have talked about political agendas.
the number of things that are happening. No question. I mean, it is humanitarian because I'm not humanitarian, but it's for the humans.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. With humanitarian in my sort of world means that when you do something for the on the basis of cause, to respond to causes, that's humanitarian.
Right.
So if there is an earthquake, and then like Shigeru Ban, one of the amazing architects from Japan, and he goes and helps out designing this amazing temporary shelters.
Mm-hmm.
That's the humanitarian architecture.
Right.
There's a flood and or tsunami, and then some architects run for helping those communities, or the communities come together and do it themselves. Well, that's humanitarian.
Right.
But speculative architecture is all about capital. It's all about real estate.
Or can we call it humane?
Humane is possible in every walk of life. It is possible. Does everyone do that? I'm not quite sure about it.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, the majority of development is driven by speculation. Majority of development is driven by property prices. And how much can you sell after and spend very little producing it. That seems to be the way to go. So, for example, when we were doing projects in India, and I'm not going to name the clients, but we used to fight tooth and nail even before Bombay decided to make two means of egress or two staircases, two exit stairs, a requirement. We said we are not going to design a building which doesn't have two means of egress.
Right.
We insisted on having two staircases. And it was an uphill battle because code didn't require it. Code did not require it.
Right.
The staircases were left open.
Yeah.
Most of the time. We wanted to enclose them with fire enclosures. That wasn't allowed. The doors in an office building, we said these are going to have to be fire doors, not allowed. So, the human approach, architects can try, but there are sort of very many roadblocks. So if you're a principal architect, it's very hard to produce the kind of architecture you want to produce.
Right.
So, our profession is kind of a noble profession, actually. Architects also have to understand, if you design a building that actually jeopardizes human life, then you're not doing your job. So public safety, public health. So the building might not collapse, and there might not even be fire, but the quality of construction, the quality of materials you use, healthy materials versus sort of materials that emit what do you call fumes, right? They can be harmful. Very often I ask clients not to use a particular paint, and they ask me why, and I explain to them that it's lead-based, and lead's not good for children.
Yeah.
Or such and such VCT is not good. I don't like to use vinyl. I don't like to use the lacquer, which is chemical-based.
Right.
Or I won't like to use certain paints because they have fumes. So it begins to become problematic in more ways than one. But yes, the potential for architecture to remain humane is there, but no one will do it unless there is a law requiring it.
Right.
So the regulation has to be in place. In this part of the world, things will not be approved if you're not meeting or complying with certain requirements.
Right. So any experience where you have worked here? We once in a conversation we was talking about the TP scheme, the town planning scheme. So if you can tell me if you had these experiences where you found it to be very different than in the New York City, where obviously the policy and governance is quite strict, and as compared to this. So do you think we are lagging somewhere?
I think there are a few things there. I think some of the sort of planning institutions and sort of bureaucratic structure of how the projects get approved and plans get approved, or how cities get sort of planned. All of that is sort of still looking back at the 19th century models. And it's still using the sort of colonial era planning tools to design 21st century cities. So it's problematic. But on the other hand, because there are so many loopholes, some good architects actually can come in and start doing something better. So there's room for good and bad both, unfortunately. And the worst part of the story is that it's always the folks that go on to abuse or take advantage
Right.
of the sort of short-sighted planning strategies. That is problematic. So if you mentioned city of New York, this city is actually planned from scratch. It didn't exist.
Yeah.
So it was laid out with a map, even when there were no buildings there. And then lots were subdivided. Land use was put in place. Commercial only on the avenues,
Mm-hmm.
residential on the streets.
Yeah.
Residential above commercial was permitted. Things
Right.
like that. So all the sort of short point that I'm in a long-winded way I'm trying to make is that the regulation is in place. It's being tweaked as we go. The
Okay.
zoning is in place, but there's also a mechanism with which the community can have an input. So if there is a very large project that's going to affect more than few city blocks, the community has to weigh in and they have to give
Right.
their opinion. So those structures are in place.
Mm-hmm.
So, there are hearings. Today evening, I was in a hearing actually, which is why I was late coming back to this meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a city council hearing where I had to go
Right.
and tell them that why I was against a very large building being converted
Mm-hmm.
into a commercial building. And then we explain everything to them, not because I'm not a preservationist, uh, and I'm not. My architecture is sort of pretty contemporary, and I consider myself to be you know, a modernist,
Correct.
and that's an older building, but because of the sort of damage it was going to do to the fabric, which is
Mm-hmm.
why we started talking about it. But listen, you're going to increase traffic flows, you're going to increase strain on the utilities and infrastructure, and you haven't planned for it. So first ask for that plan.
Yeah.
So I'll just give you another sort of silly example. If I'm designing a building in New
Mm-hmm.
York City, I do all kinds of fantastic drawings and renderings and whatnot, and I submit my plans to Department of Buildings, and the very first drawing that they look at, they don't look at anything else. The only drawing they look at first time is builder's builder's paving plan. Sorry,
Okay.
builder's paving plan. Now,
Okay.
what is builder's paving plan is that okay, here is a lot. There was a very small building there. Only 30% of the land was covered by
Mm-hmm.
that building. Now you are going to cover 65% of the land with the building. So all the permeable surfaces that are going to get covered, the water percolation is going to decrease.
Mm-hmm.
You actually are going to put up a building that's going to produce X amount of sewer trash. So show us what are the paved areas and what is unpaved, and how you're going to retain water
Mm-hmm.
that the building is going to collect, and you're not going to throw it into the sewer line directly. So you have to
Oh.
hold it for 2 hours. You have to hold
Okay.
the rainwater on your site for 2 hours or 3 hours, depending on the size of the development. You have to produce that drawing, and that drawing has nothing to do with architecture.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
just a
Absolutely.
kind of landscape plan,
Yeah.
and it shows what is paved. They don't want to know how fancy your architecture is. They don't want to know how great a name you are. You might be Frank Gehry, or you
Mm-hmm.
might be whoever else.
Mm-hmm.
All they want to see is how are you taking care of this water?
Brilliant.
Where are you collecting it?
Mm-hmm.
Is your underground retention tank is
Yeah.
large enough to hold water at the
Okay.
peak time?
Right.
Now that's the drawing they approve. Now what I'm trying to explain to you is that it's never an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
Never an after. That's the last drawing people will probably want to look at. But that's the first drawing they look at. And that drawing doesn't get reviewed by the Department of Buildings. It
Okay.
gets reviewed by Department of Sanitation and
Right.
the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection.
Okay.
They are the ones who have to okay it.
Mm-hmm.
If it is a tall building, I have to give them the fire egress diagram.
Yes.
There are two drawings, and they go to the fire department for approval.
Right.
And if fire department doesn't approve those drawings, your project is not approved. It might be the fanciest project.
Okay. Wow.
So a lot of times people ask me, why did it take New York City 10 years
Mm-hmm.
to start construction on World Trade Center site after it was destroyed. This is the reason why.
Wow. Okay. That's something which we probably do not follow here.
No, community engagement is a big problem in
Yeah.
cities like Bombay,
Yes.
and because of the requirements are very lax.
Mm-hmm.
So regulation matters, and not only regulation, enforcement.
Yes.
Because
Enforcement. Correct.
even when you have regulation right now in New York, I mean in Bombay, that you can't do this, you can't do that, but no one is enforcing that regulation, so you get away
Right.
very easily.
And also, I feel that here it's more like architects have been working in silos, whereas it has to have different aspects. Like you correctly mentioned that you have your fire department in place, you have the sanitation department in place. You need to have approvals. Here, things are happening, and later people are being involved, and all sort of mess is happening at that side. The layers are not solved. Like there is no chronology which a person is
Yeah.
following, and probably this is one of the reasons why we are in a situation like this, where we have seen mass flooding happening and what sort of things are not happening, right? Okay. Correct.
I'll give you another example. I mean, you're on a good topic, so stay on with it. I'll tell you another example. In Bombay, the metro is being planned.
Yeah, of
There's
course.
no community engagement. There's no presentations made to the community. Currently, I'm actually on a city advisory committee, and Port Authority bus terminal.
All right.
There's an expansion project. The land is owned by the government, state government, not even local government, and not only one state, two states, New York State and New Jersey.
Okay.
It's their own building, their own land. They have to expand it. They are doing everything by the law and by the book. But before it goes to anybody else, they have to come and speak to the community and talk to the community. Why? They're expanding it, which means they're going to have more buses coming in,
Right.
which means there are more people coming in, which means there's going to be more requirement for parking. There's going to be increased traffic. There's going to be traffic jam. There's
Right.
going to be pollution. So
Right.
they are coming and giving us, and people are asking a very simple question. How many buses are you increasing? Are these buses going to be electric buses,
Mm-hmm.
or are they going to be fuel based? Right. So the project is going through what is known as EPA statement, and that's environmental impact statement. Sorry, EIA statement.
EIA. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Great.
it's called environmental impact assessment, and
Correct.
that's what it is going through right now. Similarly, Penn Station wants to expand, and they have no money, so they want to generate money. So they want
Mm-hmm.
to sell some of the development rights for residential development, for office building across the street, and that has to first go through the community board hearing.
Wow.
It
Okay.
doesn't go to DOB, it doesn't go to city planning.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is okay. City planning is okay with it.
Yeah.
So if they submit, let's say, for example, they say, no, forget community, we don't need to talk to anyone. We are the government, we can do what we want.
True.
And they go to DOB, DOB say, we don't have the community sign off on this. We cannot review this project. So
Mm-hmm.
it comes back.
Wow. Okay. The best
So
part is you're involving people. What more? Because you have to involve people in what you're doing. You need to have some sort of consent, and there's so much back and forth which has been going around in a city like Mumbai. And till the time people are not involved, the entire concept of development or the redevelopment schemes comes to them as a very alien concept. You are like, you have slums. The builder comes in. You have the entire redevelopment scheme that's happening. Literally people are selling off those and getting back to newer slums. They are not happy with those.
that's what happens.
Yeah,
That,
exactly.
that's what happens. In the name of development, you can increase displacement. You can actually gentrify a neighborhood, push
True.
the property values up. All the service sector folks have to leave the city. Their families are disrupted. Family life is disrupted because now their kids don't have the right school to go to.
Right.
All of that begins to happen, and it's very commonly happening. I'm not trying to criticize what is happening in India. I'm trying to point out that some part, this city, before it became what it has become today, must have gone through exactly the same thing. We're
Absolutely.
talking about development over 300 years. India is not even 100 years since its independence yet. So you're talking about very, very different scenario, historically speaking. but it's not something that should take another 100 years to be fixed.
Yes.
So there are mechanisms in place, there are planning tools in place that make these requirements come to fruition because they are the requirements. So I think that that kind of overhaul is definitely required, and the profession itself has to engage with the community in a different way. So I think if the communities don't make noise, don't expect the politicians to come back with solutions. It has to happen the other way around.
Right.
If people start rejecting and showing up
Right.
to kind of protest in a positive way, in a constructive way,
Right. In fact,
things
I would
can
just
begin
like to
to
tell you
change.
that very recently, I don't know if you have gone through the articles and the media where, the RA colony, the RA forest area was going to be raised out for a metro station to come in place. And people protested, a lot of public came out. They did not really, there was a lot of protest and everything, which was happening for a couple of months now. And now finally, just I think last week, this has been decided that RA is going to remain because RA is has a major forest cover here in Mumbai. So they are the lungs of the city, and of course this
So
is not.
I'm not even talking about that level of protest. I mean, you might not have to do that, but just insisting and expecting quality and change in a peaceful way, in a Gandhian way, you can make that happen, right? But the problem is very different. Even when you know that somebody is doing something wrong, people don't point it out.
Right.
So if a developer is doing something improper, people don't care. And that's the thing, that you have to begin to care for the place much more.
Right.
And you talked about sort of this Western sort of influence, or whatever you want to call it. There's nothing wrong with absorbing and learning from others. But you can learn by not repeating their mistakes. Learn from their mistakes. Don't repeat them.
Correct.
So the advantage India has is not to ape mistakes of the West, but learn from it. We are undoing a lot of our mistakes. COVID has taught us something remarkable. We're reducing the number of cars on the streets. 480 miles of bike paths have been put in place. And I'm not saying that's great and that's fantastic. I mean, it is great. It's possible to do that because there are mechanisms in place. There's affluence, there's money, there's political will. But the political will was not there. I am telling you right now, you might not believe it, but in 2003, my office was at Fifth Avenue at the corner of 14th Street. And I don't know if you know, but I ride my bicycle every single day, even now. I ride about 18 miles every single day, every evening. When I come from work, that's my workout. I don't go to gym. I actually work out with my bike. And the rest of the time when I have to travel, I don't travel by train. I don't drive in a car. I go on my bicycle everywhere I go. Right. So we were asking for a bicycle rack, and that was hard. Oh, not that long ago. I'm talking about 2005, around that time. Right. That was about 15 years ago.
Yes.
Today, New York City has more than 480 miles of bicycle path.
Wow.
And every block has a bicycle rack. You don't have to beg for it. There's not one, there's not two, there are 10 of them.
Right.
And there's bike sharing program and whatnot. We're talking about bike equity now. Right. One lane of traffic is taken away in the name of open streets. So we have a project we sort of put together. It's called Open Streets, and our city has more than 40 miles of open streets.
Wow.
Open streets means the cars don't go through.
Yes, yes.
Only pedestrians go through because of social distancing requirements.
Right. No, even these smaller things have started to come in, the bike sharing thing which you're saying, the open streets which you're saying, they have started to come into place with I'm sure you're aware of the smart city movement which is running here, if you're aware of. So in the smart city movement there are various policy and governance also which is coming into place, and now the undoing part which is saying, so the things are trying to See, of course, it is going to take time. The build up which is there, it is.
It's very jarring when I hear that. It's very jarring. On one hand, you're doing Bandra Kurla complex that looks like New Jersey, actually, right?
Yeah.
With wide open streets, no people, no cows, no nothing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And you talk about shared streets. I mean,
Mhm.
we actually look at everybody else looks at. You asked me to talk about messy urbanism. That's what
Yes.
I mean by that.
Okay.
Indian streets are most shared, not only by humans and cars and whatever else, but even by animals. And that's the beautiful thing. I'm not trying to romanticize it.
Yeah.
The, the reason why I'm mentioning it is that everything is shared by default. When you have very little, you have to share, and that's understood.
Yeah.
At any given time in Mumbai, there are more people outdoors
Correct.
than there are people indoors.
Right.
Not because they love it, but it becomes a necessity. I
Mhm.
jokingly tell my students that necessity is the mother of innovation, and boredom is the mother of design.
True.
You do jugaad, you do what you need to do because you must do it. There's no other option,
Yes.
right? I mean, who wants to actually grow vegetables by the side of the train tracks,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But people do that. Why? Because it's a necessity. But if you do that here, it will be looked at as, oh wow, look at that amazing urban farming idea. I mean,
Yeah.
they've been doing it for centuries, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So what I'm
Absolutely.
trying to say is that look, there's a lot to learn from within,
Mhm.
and there's a lot to learn from somewhere else. But
Yes.
learn from what is wrong and what is right both, and do not repeat. I mean, I'm not saying that to India alone. Here right now, I'm setting up a lecture series in the school that I teach, where
Mhm.
basically I'm telling them there is a way to look at other cultures and learn from them.
Mhm. Wow.
And from if you look at my regime, it is looking at innovation. It is actually proposing amazing new infrastructure, but it's still pretty much part of the culture of the place.
Okay.
They're trying to avoid displacement.
Mhm.
They are turning their transportation system in totally differently.
Right.
Bogota has a bus transit system. When they implemented that, there was no displacement.
Mhm.
Ahmedabad is boasting about doing something similar. They've erased parts of the city to make room for the bus transit system. So how do you explain that? They have literally removed fabric
Yeah.
of the city in the old city to make way for the bus transit in such a terrible way. They actually cut buildings half, literally half, and then left. Okay, you fix your building on your own. You got
Yeah.
paid. That's it. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot more room for a kind of conversation that could actually yield positive architecture, positive city design. And I think more than smart streets, I think we have to be smarter,
Yeah.
the users. And I think streets are pretty smart on their
Yeah.
own. Technology is not going to solve everything.
True.
It can help solve some of it. But I think the mindset, the human mindset,
Mhm.
needs to work with it as well.
Right. Absolutely. So, just curious to know a little more about the messy urbanism. You have been doing research in the area of informal architecture in the cities like Mumbai, Chennai, New Delhi, right? So, what prompted you to take such a research? Any particular reason why you thought about this? Also, you talk about small but implementable changes, right? Uh, did you come across some kind of intervention, some kind of pointers probably which we can take up, or any kind of
Um,
similarity, disparity?
I am not quite sure exactly how it began, but I think it sort of began with the interest that I had in design.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm not quite sure exactly which way to approach this. But if you want to talk about messy urbanism,
Hmm.
that began to sort of take place because of my interest in photography.
Yeah.
believe it or not. So every time when I travel to India, and when I was in India, I would go taking photographs. Something you guys don't know. Every weekend, when the office was closed, I would take Rajesh, the driver,
Yeah.
and he would take me to all these different places. And there was one driver at one point in time, and he would take me to the slums. My
Mm-hmm.
interest in places like Dharavi predates that,
Right.
and so when you look at how organic city form comes about, how the small aggregate multiplies itself and becomes a cluster and a village, and then there's a whole life that sort of evolves around it. It drew my attention only when I began to recognize how these things came about and why did they come about. Who you understand the history of the people who made a place like Dharavi happen, right? So then you begin to understand, my God, there's much more than meets the eye.
Yeah.
There was no land there. These were the workers who came to Bombay to work on during during the British time when they were building mills and housing for some of those mill workers. These were the construction workers, the migrant workers that came to Bombay to work,
Yeah.
and then they would take construction debris and throw it in near Mitti River, which is where Dharavi is. It was a swamp,
True.
and they started filling up the swamp and actually created land. So there was no land to start with. So they made the land. There was no housing for them because government had declared both intellectual and fiscal bankruptcy. So
Right.
people had to come up with their own plans
True.
to make or provide for themselves for housing. MADA and all of that came much later.
Yeah.
So and then today, if you look at it, those families have lived there for a very long time. They are very hardworking, industrious folks. They have an economy of their own. They take care of 65% almost of recycling needs of city of Mumbai.
Right. Right.
So the city doesn't have to spend that kind of money. The economy is $650 million annually,
Yeah.
believe it or not, which is equivalent of the deficit of Bombay Municipal Corporation, believe
Oh.
it or not.
Oh.
And if you take them away, you basically are displacing an economy of $650 million.
Correct. Correct.
The amount of money that local authorities collect in bribes from people who live in Dharavi,
Mm-hmm.
actually, that is equivalent of the deficit. I'm sorry, that is equivalent of the deficit
Okay.
of of Mumbai Municipal Corporation.
Yeah.
So we did a study through Columbia University at one point in time, and with the city authorities, we made a proposal. Instead
Mm-hmm.
of taking those as bribes, why don't you collect them as tax
Mm.
and then put that into the coffers of municipal corporation? Their answer was very simple. If you take that as tax and you legitimize
Yes.
Dharavi, and they
Right.
don't want to do that because then you're saying, oh yes, you own this property now.
Yeah.
But they will not do that. So there's no infrastructure being put in place because these are not real communities. Oh, and yes, to answer your question, I was in Venezuela,
Mm-hmm.
and we were doing a studio there, and then we were going to look at one particular neighborhood, informal settlement. And when we went to the corporation and they showed us a map, that entire site didn't exist on the map. It was a vacant lot on the map. So we asked them, why is it a vacant lot? Oh, it is a vacant lot. I said, no, but we just came from there.
Mm-hmm.
There are thousands and thousands of people who live there. Oh, no, no, they're there illegally.
Oh God. Oh my God.
So
Okay.
the map showed it as a blank site. And I said, this is amazing. This is very, very interesting.
Okay.
So geographies would erase the existence of an entire community, or the maps would erase the existence of an entire community and will
Oh.
not even acknowledge that they exist.
Yeah.
And I said, that is amazing. This is where sort of the whole conversation about community and property comes into play. What are the community rights?
Right.
People have right to the city. And I'm quoting a remarkable book by David Harvey. It's called Right to the City.
Okay.
And it is denied constantly.
Right.
And that sort of drew me into understanding it. And then you begin to recognize that there's something, and again, it's not a romantic notion. When I say it's messy urbanism, it's messy by design. It's messy because it needs to be. It's messy in a way in which actually it's alive and it's thriving. It's
Right.
lyrical. It grows. It's a living fabric, so to speak.
Correct.
And that's the beauty of it. And there's a lot to learn from it. And because of that, it's a culture. I mean, you have to understand, it's part of cultural fabric as much as it is part of the city fabric. Number one. Number two, it helps the economy in a particular way. So there's a parasitical relationship between the formal city and the informal. And I don't even know why we call it informal. There's nothing informal about it. It has a form.
Yes.
Right? It exists. It's physical. It is a kind of formality. It's a different kind of formality.
Yeah.
So we have to understand what is the sort of what is the shape of that formality?
Yeah.
What is the pulse of that formality? Right? And we have to begin to understand that. And I mean, I can go on and on about that, but that drew my attention. That there's something to learn from it.
Right.
And in today's context, when we talk about sustainability and resilience, these are the most resilient neighborhoods.
Yes, indeed.
Right? The fires come, the floods come, whatever happens, they survive. The point is not to keep them the way they are. Learn from what they are, how they function, and fix them, revise them.
Right.
But let them do it. Don't come in from outside and say, okay, I'm going to erase all of this here, and I'm the architect. I got plans for you. I'm going to fix this whole place up. No, that's not the attitude. They know how to build. They know how to make things. They know how to. They probably don't know how to plan, but they probably know how to plan better than you do in their own way. So if you learn how,
exactly. Consensus, it's exactly. Important.
Not only that, it's just the way they think. Yeah, it's just the way they think. You know, when I came to Bombay, Judith, I told you she's German, but she told me one thing: do not try to tell a rickshaw driver how to get where you want to go.
Yeah.
Because he will take you to a wrong place. But if you tell him where you want to go, he will take you to the right place. Right. And I learned that right away because they get annoyed.
Right. Of course.
They don't want to be prompted to make a left, make a right, make a left, just tell me where do you want to go. I mean, that's the beauty of it. So what I'm trying to say is that that's what you learn about, this user-generated sort of urban form. So it wasn't to romanticize, it wasn't to sort of glorify. Yeah. Of course it is dysfunctional. Of course it has problems, many problems. Of course those problems need to be fixed. But the assumption that somebody else can fix those problems might be misplaced. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. So people have to begin to understand how to approach these zones.
Right.
But since they were generated by people who live there, let them regenerate their own way of living and life, rather than you coming and putting up this. We went to Dharavi a number of times, and Mada buildings looked much worse than the buildings that were, the shantytown buildings, right? Because people had made them with love and care. Yeah. So that's what you learn. Were they properly built? No. Do they have proper sanitation? No. Can they be much better than that? Yes. So teach them what you know, but don't teach them to take away what they already know. Yeah. Teach them to add to what they know and redirect it. And it is possible to do it. Totally possible. So that is my interest. So the messy is a kind of a lyrical term. It's messy by design.
Yeah. You have been a part of academia for a long period of time. Like, as much time you dedicate into your projects, I think equal or more you have been dedicated to education, right? So you have been a part of prestigious institutes like Columbia University, Pratt, And also, right now, I think you are at Spitzger School of Architecture,
Mhm.
and
Yes.
you have been doing a lot of studio projects with a lot of schools. I would want to ask you that what is the kind of approach that you guys have at your studios, probably of what we can try and use here, because here the approach to architecture education is different than what probably you guys have. So do you, and also you have seen the kind of academia we have here. So you think there is something that we can start using it when it comes to architecture education, to start to put in conscious effort for the students to learn more about this, the kind of conversation we have had, so that they do not repeat the mistakes. It's important for them to know, right? So do you think we need to start at that grassroots level?
So yes, I've been teaching for quite some time. Actually, I had the, I don't know how to describe it, but I was fortunate or unfortunate to have started teaching even when I was studying. Actually,
Oh, okay.
so believe it or not, but that did happen. I actually also had the misfortune of teaching my own classmates formally. So because they were behind, and so when I graduated, I started teaching right away, or part time. I never always wanted to practice. I never wanted to be a full time teacher. So even now, I'm not a full time teacher. I'm adjunct, and I teach what I like to teach. Meaning, I structure my own studios,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't fit into the sort of pre-established thematics of the school. I design my own syllabus
Yeah.
and put together sort of project brief that students have to respond to.
Yeah.
And I teach architecture, I teach urban design. Sometimes I combine the two into one studio. Sometimes I combine architecture, I mean, not combine, but I offer a studio where we have students from architecture, urban design, product design, communications design,
Mm-hmm.
photography, journalism,
Okay, great.
and environmental engineering.
Mm-hmm.
So we've done that at Columbia University a couple of times, very successfully. Um, and you'll wonder why, what would journalism folks do?
Mm-hmm.
Joining an architectural studio. But that was a particular site where I just told you the entire community participation
Yeah.
um, um, scenario, where environmental justice becomes extremely important. Someone has to report on things that are not right. So that falls under journalism. We also had two students from law school,
Oh, wow.
for environmental law, and
Yeah.
they were interested in learning about how architecture, real estate developments actually come about and how lawyers engage with
Right.
understanding this kind of phenomena. So it's very differently structured kind of education system here. School of Architecture set was remarkable, absolutely no doubt about it, but it was also based on Western kind of tenets and instructional modules. And they kind of pretty much lived with those, but they've tweaked them. They were sort of improved somewhat. They changed, but they used to be pretty balanced, and teachers were very sort of focused on making sure that you don't lose sight of the culture that you belong to
Yeah.
while learning from the cultures that you do not belong to. Because there's something called, people ask me, which culture do you belong to? And I say,
Mm-hmm.
I don't quite know. I think
Mm-hmm.
I manufactured my own culture now. But most of it comes from where I was born.
Yeah.
And you can't take that away from me ever. Because it's, in every blood, every cell of my body. So, but at the same time, what you acquire, so there's acquired culture,
Mm-hmm.
there's um, innate culture, the culture that you're born with, the
Yeah.
culture that you acquire, there's intellectual culture that you become part of.
Right.
So all of those combined basically either make you totally schizophrenic or they make you a very interesting person. I don't know. Jury's out there trying to figure that
Mm-hmm.
out. But
Right.
the whole point is that yes, education is very important,
Yeah.
and what you learn, how you learn, matters a lot.
Right.
Um, and I don't quite exactly know, but education of an architect is one thing. Education of an urban designer is a bit different. And one of the reasons why I did both, after doing my architecture, I also wanted to do urban design. So and the reason why I wanted, I told you about architect Doshi.
Yeah.
who is someone that I've known for a very long time. And when I was planning to do urban design, he asked me, "Why do you want to do urban design?"
Yeah.
Because I thought you wanted to practice as an architect. I said, "I'm always going to practice architecture. And yes, I'm going to practice urban design too. But I want to do urban design so I can do responsible and responsive
Yeah.
architecture.
Absolutely.
So that it's not something that I just, I'm not trying to create singular objects
Yeah.
or singular statements. They have to belong to the context and the culture, and they have to
Right.
respond to climate. I mean, that's my principle in life. So going back to the education scenario, um, if you want me to talk about India, is that what you want me to talk about?
Yeah.
So education in India has changed quite a lot in every walk of life, not only architecture. It's become very transactional. It's become very commercialized. It's become an industry. There are very many private schools. There are very many schools, actually, too many schools. And very many students are being sort of produced.
Yeah.
And I teach here at Columbia University at City College. I've taught at WashU in St. Louis. Not many Indian students there, but some of the known university, Boston, New York, you find a lot of students that come from India.
Yeah.
And you can tell that they actually are hungry. They want to learn because they don't feel they've learned enough. And that is very unfortunate because there are some very good schools even in India. And if every other school starts doing something similar,
Yeah.
I think the quality of education would help the profession
Right.
in a
Right.
big, big way.
Right.
And if you're asking me why I teach because that's the best way to learn.
Yeah.
I don't teach because I know everything. I teach because I don't know anything. I don't know everything.
Right.
And when you are with younger students and they have questioning minds,
Mm-hmm.
they keep you alive, they keep you engaged, they keep you alert, and
Right.
they make you think about everything you thought you knew. Because then you get comfortable. The moment you think you know everything, you get comfortable, you repeat yourself,
Right.
and you become boring in no time.
Yeah.
But when you have to answer some young person's question, you have to think harder about it.
Right.
You say, "Oh, why did I do that?" Just the way you asked me, why did you do why do you do urban design? Why do you teach? Right? For example,
Yeah.
it's not a ready-made answer. You have to think about it because you've never sort of thought about it before.
Right. You know what? This actually brings me back to office days when we used to sit in the studio, and one fine day we were having some conversation about some project, and you used to always carry your DSLR with you. I remember. So and we were sitting, and I don't know, we were working on some model, and you were not very happy with that. You just crumbled the thing and just threw it somewhere. Almost after an hour you came back and just took that piece of paper, the it just opened up a little, and you made us all sit together, the kind of discussions you're talking about. We and you said that, let's make the model out. I don't know if you remember this or not, but you told us that, okay, let's make a model out of it. And we all started to look at each other. If you were serious, why would you crumble a paper, throw it, come after an hour and ask us to make a model out of it? And that we did. We worked on it, and it I'm trying to recollect the project for which we actually made this model. You remember that project which had the gas line at the center, and we made bridges across? So you've gone on mute, sorry.
Yeah, City Plus.
City Plus, yes. So there was this gas line, and later you asked us to make strips and envelop the entire building. And we did what not. I still have the pictures with me. And when I look back, I was like, wow, why did we do that? And that process which you're saying, even though I was an intern that time, but I got to learn so many things. Like, I'm pretty sure you conduct your studios in a brilliant manner to go back and forth. You know, we tried.
If you
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry, go on.
if you want to now because everyone is teaching online, I will
Mm.
invite you to one of my studios if you want to come. I
Oh, I
just did
would love
yesterday,
to. Oh, I would love
and
to.
our studios go on for about 4 to 5 hours at
Wow,
a
okay.
stretch.
Yeah,
So yeah, yesterday just we did that. No, it is fun. It's a process, right? It's
yeah,
always that, and few things that you learn by teaching
Yeah.
are a lot more important than what you learn by learning. So,
Right.
so in other words, when you're teaching students, um, you immediately recognize that what you thought you knew
Mm-hmm.
um, might have to be looked at a bit differently.
Right.
Maybe it was too nice. Maybe it was too okay. Maybe it just made sense because it was familiar.
Yeah.
But somebody else comes in and says something entirely different,
Right.
and that changes your own way of looking at it. But yeah, I mean, education of an architect is a tough thing. Not because I'm teaching, but because it depends on the attitude. And some teachers like to think in the old school way, where they assume the role of a teacher. I don't do that. I can't do it. So even in the office, you must have recognized that. Yes, sometimes I would get this or that, but it was always the teamwork. It was always you sort of sit down, and when you sit down, you're part of the team.
Yes. Yes.
And it's that collaboration that you actually engage in. You don't walk into the studio saying, okay, here is a sketch, draw it up. Now that's a very boring way of working.
Yeah.
Okay. But you come and say, okay, this is what we're planning to do. Why don't you try something?
Yes.
Why don't you just think about certain plan organization, this organization, that organization? Why don't you start with a model, for example? Right?
Right.
And you wonder, if you don't even have plans and sections in place, why are we doing a model? Right?
True.
I don't know if you remember, but 3D was an important thing all the time.
Absolutely. How can I forget?
So, and the reason being that you very often if you start with plan, then you start doing extrusions and you start sort of pulling things up in a sort of particular way. But if you're designing, there are different ways in which people design. You're not making a form; you're making space. Space making is extremely important. So it's place making.
Yes.
So how do you sort of do the two together?
Right.
Only when you actually look at architecture in context and not devoid of context.
Right.
So yes, day before I think it was Wednesday, we had our studio pin up, and I invited some guests. And one of the guests who always comes to my studio, then she said, because the students were talking about so many different things. One of the reviewers said, "Oh, I thought you guys were just looking at Pier 76.
Oh.
Why are you talking about West Harlem?
Mm-hmm.
West Harlem is like about 10 miles away from the site. That's not part of your context."
Oh. Yeah.
And I said, no, it is. I think students will explain that. And before I could say anything further, June, the other lady, she came on board and she said, oh, no, you have to understand. In Viren Studios,
Yeah.
even if you want to talk about a little daisy,
Mm-hmm.
you have to first describe the whole forest.
Oh my God. Wow. All right.
And there's a reason for it. And then the students came back, and the connection between Hudson Yards and Harlem is economic displacement. It's about gentrification. It's about uh, inappropriate appropriation of funds that were earmarked for Harlem being used in a very affluent neighborhood. So there's a kind of political landscape that we need to describe. It's the political context that will situate this project, for example. So now when you begin to put that in context, people begin to understand. Now, I had never told my students what to look for. All I had said is that we're going to look at these two contexts. The building is going to be here in Chelsea, but you're going to look at Harlem. They figured that out on their own. Why are we looking at Harlem? Why does he want us to look at Harlem? Same question. So the point is very simple. That very often you throw darts in the dark,
Right.
and some of them hit the right place and the right spots,
Right.
and others fall off, right? But it's the ones that hit the right spots, they matter.
Right.
The rest you can forget about.
So, yes, I think this brings us to the end of the conversation. And there are a few pointers which, we will take up in the live session when we have other panel members. And, I want to have a cross discussion over education also. So we will again see you on the 20th.
Sounds good.
Right? Okay. Thank you so much. It is always such a pleasure talking to you. You know, I get to learn
Good to
so
see
many
you
things.
again, Prachi.
Very good to see you.